Something shifts, but there's no argument, no dramatic exit, no final speech, just silence. And if you're paying attention, that silence is louder than anything they've ever said. Because when an empath goes quiet, it's not confusion. It's not weakness. It's not even sadness. It's a decision. Empaths are not impulsive people. Their entire psychological wiring is built around emotional data collection. They observe tone, microexpressions, inconsistencies. They replay conversations, analyze meaning, and try sometimes for far too long to make things work. So by the time they go quiet, they've already run the simulation 100 times in their head, and every version ends the same way. This is where most people misunderstand what's happening. They think the empath is pulling away. They think maybe they need space. They think it's temporary. It's not. What you're seeing is the final stage of emotional detachment. Psychologically, this is called withdrawal of emotional investment. The brain, after prolonged stress or disappointment, begins to conserve energy. It stops pouring resources into something that no longer produces safety, trust, or reciprocity. And for an empath, this process is even more intense because they don't disconnect easily. They endure, they explain, they forgive, they adjust. So when all of that stops, it means something fundamental has broken, where here's what's really happening inside their mind. At first, they were hyper aware of you. They noticed everything, your moods, your needs, your unspoken signals. But over time, something changed. The effort became one-sided. The emotional exchange became unbalanced, and their nervous system picked up on it long before they consciously admitted it. This is where science steps in. Empaths tend to have higher activity in brain regions associated with emotional processing like the anterior insula and mirror neuron systems. That means they don't just understand emotions, they feel them. So when they're in a relationship where something is off, where energy isn't reciprocated, or authenticity is missing, their brain registers it as stress, chronic stress. And the brain has one primary goal under stress: protect. So instead of continuing to invest, it starts to pull back, quietly, internally, strategically. And this is the part most people miss. By the time the empath goes silent externally, they've already detached internally. That's why there's no big confrontation, no emotional explosion, no desperate attempt to fix things at the last moment, because they already tried, many times, in ways you probably didn't even notice. The quiet isn't the beginning of the end, it's the confirmation. Now here's where it gets even more precise. Watch their behavior, not their words. Because when an empath is still emotionally engaged, they'll ask questions, they'll seek clarity, they'll try to understand. But when they've checked out, they stop asking, they stop reacting, they stop explaining. And most importantly, they stop feeling responsible for fixing it. That's the shift. Responsibility disappears. And once that happens, the connection is already gone, whether the relationship physically ends or not. This is what creates confusion for the other person. Because from the outside, it looks calm, but internally it's final. You won't hear the moment it ends because it doesn't end with noise. It ends with silence. And that silence is not empty. It is the final product of a brain that has already processed everything over and over again until there is nothing left to feel. An empath does not wake up one day and decide to go quiet. That would be too simple, too impulsive, too human in the ordinary sense. No, what actually happens is far more unsettling. Their brain starts collecting data long before you ever notice a change. Every tone shift, every delayed reply, every inconsistency between words and behavior gets recorded. Not consciously at first, but neurologically. Because empathy is not just emotional, it's biological. Studies show that when empaths observe someone else's emotions, their brain activates the same neural pathways as if they were experiencing it themselves. That means when something feels off, they don't just notice it, they feel it. And the more they feel it, the more their nervous system begins to carry the weight of something that was never theirs to begin with. This is where the slow erosion begins. At first, they try to fix it. They adjust their tone. They become more patient. They give more, explain more, tolerate more, because their brain is wired for connection. But here's the part that changes everything. The human body cannot sustain unresolved emotional stress forever. Research shows that simply observing someone else's distress can activate a full stress response in the body, including the release of cortisol, the hormone linked to anxiety, fatigue, and emotional burnout. Now imagine living in that state repeatedly, not because of your own emotions, but because you're absorbing someone else's. At some point, the brain makes a decision, not a loud one, not a dramatic one, a protective one. It begins to reduce emotional investment, silently. Because from a neurological perspective, continuing to engage would mean continuing the stress cycle. And the brain is designed to survive, not suffer endlessly. So instead of reacting, it starts observing. Instead of expressing, it starts withdrawing. Instead of hoping, it starts accepting. And this is where most people completely misread the situation. They think the empath is becoming distant, cold, uninterested. But what's actually happening is far more precise. The empath is no longer feeding the emotional loop that once kept the connection alive, because that loop has already been broken internally. And here's the disturbing truth: by the time you notice the silence, their brain has already detached, not out of anger, not out of revenge, but out of exhaustion. There is a concept in neuroscience called empathic distress. It describes what happens when someone feels too much for too long without resolution. Instead of creating connection, it creates withdrawal, because the brain cannot distinguish between emotional overload and physical danger forever. Eventually, it treats both the same. It shuts down the source. And when that happens, something irreversible begins. The empath stops asking questions, not because they don't care, but because they already know the answers. They stop reacting, not because nothing affects them, but because everything already did. They stop explaining, not because they have nothing to say, but because they've said it internally 1,000 times. This is the moment silence becomes dangerous, because it feels calm, but it isn't repairable. It feels like space, but it's actually distance, permanent distance. And what makes this even more unsettling is the same brain that once mirrored your emotions, that once felt your pain as its own, has now stopped mirroring you entirely. The connection at a neural level begins to fade. No more emotional synchronization. No more internal simulation of your feelings. Just stillness. And stillness in this case is not peace. It's the absence of attachment. The system has powered down. Because from the brain's perspective, continuing would be self-damage. So it chooses self-preservation instead, quietly, without warning, without closure. And by the time you finally feel the weight of that silence, by the time you start asking what changed, the truth is already behind you. Because the empath didn't leave when they went quiet. They left long before that. The silence was just the moment their body finally caught up with the decision their brain had already made. You don't see the moment an empath leaves, because they don't leave when they walk away. They leave long before that. Long before the distance, long before the silence, long before you even realize something has changed. Because the real exit doesn't happen in their actions. It happens in their nervous system. There is a version of them that was once fully present with you, hyper-aware, emotionally tuned. That's where constantly reading between the lines, picking up signals you didn't even know you were sending. That version doesn't disappear overnight. It gets worn down, slowly, quietly, systematically. At first, they lean in closer. They try to understand more. They give more of themselves to stabilize something that feels slightly off, because their brain is designed for connection. But here's what most people never realize: the human brain treats emotional inconsistency as a form of threat, not a visible one, not a physical one, but a psychological one. When words and actions don't match, when emotional signals become unpredictable, the brain cannot relax. And when the brain cannot relax, it cannot attach safely. This is where the shift begins. Deep inside the empath's nervous system, something starts to change. The same mechanisms that once created deep emotional bonding begin to activate stress responses instead. Research in neuroscience shows that unpredictable emotional environments increase activity in the amygdala, part of the brain responsible for detecting danger, which means something subtle but powerful is happening. The person they once felt safe with starts to feel like a source of stress. And that changes everything, because attachment cannot survive where the body feels unsafe. So the empath adapts. Not consciously, not dramatically, biologically. Their brain begins to reduce emotional exposure to protect itself. At first, it's almost invisible. They respond a little slower. They share a little less. They stop reacting as deeply. It doesn't look like detachment yet. It looks like they're just tired. But underneath that, something far more final is unfolding. Their brain is recalibrating. Because prolonged emotional stress doesn't just affect mood, it alters the way the brain processes connection itself. Studies show that chronic emotional strain can lower sensitivity in reward circuits, especially those involving dopamine. The same interactions that once felt meaningful start to feel neutral, flat, empty. And this is the moment where emotional withdrawal truly begins. Not when they stop talking, but when they stop feeling rewarded by the connection. When the emotional return no longer justifies the psychological cost. That's when the brain starts closing doors. Quietly, without announcement, without conflict. And here's the part that makes this so difficult to detect from the outside. They're still there. They still show up. They still respond. They still engage just enough to make everything seem normal. But internally, the distance is already growing. Because once the brain starts associating a person with stress instead of safety, it begins to detach automatically. There is no switch to turn it back on. Only patterns that reinforce or reverse the process over time. And if those patterns don't change, the detachment deepens. The empath begins to observe instead of participate. They listen, but they don't absorb. They respond, but they don't invest. They're present, but no longer connected. And this is where the illusion becomes dangerous. Because everything looks intact, but nothing is the same. The emotional bond has already been severed beneath the surface. This is what psychologists refer to as emotional disengagement to state, where the mind reduces attachment to minimize stress and preserve stability. It is not a reaction. It is a process, a slow, irreversible shift from connection to self-protection. And once it reaches a certain point, the empath stops trying, not out of anger, not out of resentment, but out of clarity. Because their brain has already calculated the outcome. It has already recognized the pattern, and it has already chosen survival over attachment. This is why, when the physical distance finally appears, it feels sudden to you. But to them, it feels overdue, because the real separation didn't happen when they left. It happened in the quiet moments where they stopped feeling safe enough to stay emotionally open. Moments you probably didn't notice. Moments that didn't seem important at the time. But moments their brain recorded with precision and stacked, one by one, until the weight of them became undeniable. And when that threshold is crossed, something final takes place. The empath no longer sees the connection as something to fix. They see it as something to exit, calmly, silently, without resistance. Because by then, there is nothing left inside them that wants to hold on. No emotional pull, no internal conflict, no hesitation. Just a quiet understanding that the bond has already ended. And by the time their actions reflect that truth, the emotional reality has been in place for a long time. That's why you never see it coming. Because you're watching behavior while their brain has already rewritten the meaning of the connection entirely. And once that meaning changes, everything else follows. Words feel powerful, until they don't. There comes a moment in every fractured connection where language loses its impact. Apologies sound correct, explanations sound logical, promises sound convincing, and yet none of them land. Because the brain has already stopped believing. When an empath reaches that stage, something fundamental has shifted beneath the surface.
It's not that they can't hear you anymore.
It's that their nervous system no longer registers your words as safety. And without safety, words are just noise. This is not emotional stubbornness. It's neurological conditioning. The human brain is designed to prioritize patterns over statements. Because patterns are predictable, and predictability is what creates a sense of control and survival. In fact, research in behavioral psychology shows that repeated actions shape belief systems far more powerfully than verbal communication ever can. The brain looks for consistency over time, not intensity in the moment. So when someone says, "I'll change," the empath's brain doesn't respond to the sentence. It scans the past. It compares. It calculates. And if the pattern doesn't match the promise gets rejected automatically. Not emotionally, biologically. This is where most people make their biggest mistake. They increase the volume of their words. They explain more. They promise more. They try to convince. But persuasion doesn't work on a brain that has already adapted to inconsistency. Because inconsistency creates a specific kind of stress response. When behavior and words don't align over time, the brain experiences what psychologists call cognitive dissonance. That tension forces the mind to resolve the conflict not by trusting more, but by trusting less. And over time, that repeated mismatch trains the brain to detach from verbal input entirely, which means something critical has happened. The empath no longer uses your words to understand you. They use your patterns to define you, where And patterns are much harder to change because patterns require time. Time requires consistency, and consistency requires discipline at a level most people are not prepared for. This is why, at this stage, even a perfect apology fails. Even the right words, delivered at the right time, with the right emotion, still fall flat. Because the empath isn't listening for what you say anymore. They're watching for what you repeat. And here's the part that feels almost unfair even if you mean it this time. Even if the intention is real, even if the emotion is genuine, the brain doesn't care about intention. It cares about evidence. And evidence is built through behavior, repeated behavior, consistent behavior, over time. There's a concept in neuroscience called neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to rewire itself based on repeated experience. But here's the catch: neuroplastic change doesn't happen through a single emotional moment. It happens through sustained repetition, which means if trust was broken through patterns, it can only be rebuilt through patterns, not speeches, not emotional conversations, not one intense effort to fix everything, but slow, consistent, observable change. And this is where reality becomes difficult, because most people want immediate results. They want forgiveness now, connection now, resolution now. But the empath's brain doesn't operate on urgency. It operates on proof. And proof takes time the other person usually isn't willing to invest. So what happens instead? They push harder. They talk more. They try to accelerate something that cannot be rushed. And in doing so, they confirm the very pattern that caused the problem in the first place. Short-term intensity followed by inconsistency, which reinforces the empath's decision to stay detached. Because now the brain has even more data, more evidence that words do not equal action. And once that belief solidifies, it becomes extremely resistant to change. This is why, in most cases, when an empath reaches this stage, the outcome is already decided. Not emotionally, but neurologically, because the brain has already formed a predictive model of what to expect. And unless that model is challenged repeatedly over time, it stays locked. This is also why silence becomes their default response. Not because they don't have anything to say, but because they no longer see value in saying it. Communication requires the belief that something will change. And when that belief is gone, words disappear, effort disappears, investment disappears. And what's left is observation. Quiet, detached observation. At this point, the empath isn't waiting for you to explain yourself. They're watching to see if you become someone different. And that transformation cannot be performed. It cannot be rushed. It cannot be faked long enough to matter. Because the brain is constantly checking for consistency, looking for cracks in the pattern. And the moment it finds one, it resets its conclusion. Nothing has changed. This is the brutal reality most people don't want to face. You cannot talk your way out of a pattern you behaved your way into. You cannot explain away repeated inconsistency. And you cannot rebuild trust with intensity alone. Only time and aligned behavior can do that. But by the time most people realize this, time is the one thing they no longer have. Because the empath has already adjusted to life without emotional dependence on the connection. They've already reduced their investment to zero. They've already found stability within themselves. So even if change finally begins, it arrives too late to matter. Because the brain has already adapted to a new normal. A normal where you are no longer essential. And once someone becomes non-essential at a neurological level, reconnection is no longer a need. It becomes a choice. And most of the time, it's a choice they quietly decide not to make.